Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Research Competition Information Session. So, Charles Darwin University acknowledged the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting and pays respect to elder past, present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So, this is the first year where we have the research competition. First, we have two rounds. The first round, the candidates have to submit abstract, title, and the keywords. So in the first round, the candidate's abstract will be selected by the panel, which include Professor Steve Rogers, Dr. Simon Moss here, and we've got Krishnan, Sammy, and also Mamoon, five judges in the panel. So with that abstract that you have submitted, which is around 250 words maximum, five top finalists into the final round on the CDU IT Code Fair. Then you would have 2-minute presentation on the stage. The audience are general public, so you have to make sure that your idea is understood by someone who has no IT background. Right? So you can have only one PowerPoint slide, no slide transitions, animation, or any movement of any kind, no electronic media like sound or video, no dancing, poems, or things. So you just have to just present and talk about it. Okay. So how are we going to judge you? We will look at 4 criteria. The first one is about the content. Is your presentation provide an understanding of the background to the research question being addressed and its significance? So in this area, what you probably want to talk about would be problem and opportunity. Okay, so something that is existing there that we need more work to look at or investigation. And then you might want to talk about the implications, how important that research is. And then it will come to comprehension. In the comprehension, we want to look at if your presentation follow a clear and logical sequence, you're not jumping back and forth, and then are you using language appropriate to non-specialist audience? This is very important because if you're talking about IT and you talk about programming language, and then people will be lost, like, what are you talking about? Yes, so we wanted to make sure that you use the language that is fit for a general audience, avoid all the jargons, terminology, and provide all the background information to give audience understanding. Okay, next thing, what we want is also engagement. Do you just speak like you're speaking to yourself, or are you speaking to another person to understand you? Okay, so we want to look at the way that you present to the audience and then engage them, make them listen to you, show enthusiasm. Okay, and then finally we will look at your communication. So we want to see that the presenter careful not to generalize their research. Did you have sufficient presence, including vocal range, maintaining steady pace, and so on? Okay, and also we look at your PowerPoint slide. So it's not like your PowerPoint slide will just give you the title and that's it. We want to see how is that going to enhance your presentation. Okay, so at this point, I'm just gonna pass this on to Simon. So Simon's going to talk a little bit more about research and then what are something that you could do for the research competition, idea, importance about it, and perhaps how are you going to take that idea into PhD studying. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Sherry. Yeah, so like for the next maybe 15 minutes or so, not too long, hopefully shorter, I just want to talk a little bit about sort of research in general. That is, why are we undertaking this process? What's the benefit of the research? In particular, what is the benefit of maybe completing a PhD in the future? How do you go about becoming eligible and that sort of thing? And then I'll move into actually how to develop your idea, identify, write your abstract, and maybe thrive on the 2-minute thesis as well. So hopefully that will be fairly short. So Sherry, can you show me maybe even to the next slide is fine. So the way I begin is I'm going to provide a few sort of true and false questions, and you have to answer what true or false. So the first question is, should you apply for a PhD in the future? Should you pursue a PhD? And of course, the answer depends on you, but let me provide some insights that could be quite useful. So firstly, as you probably know, in the future, employers won't necessarily be seeking people who are specialists in a particular field or domain, because essentially the domain, jobs, work, roles, duties, demands of industry just shift so quickly. So if you develop too much specialization in a particular field or technique, then you might not necessarily be able to secure future jobs as the industries and demands of the industry change quite dramatically. Next slide. Unfortunately, one back. Unfortunately, also, employers don't necessarily want to see people who are generalists, who are sort of very good at lots of different skills and jobs either. And that's because as technology improves, there is this sort of focus and need to actually develop much more advanced skills. So there's just a little bit of noise in the background, but hopefully that'll fixed in a moment. But and so as a consequence of that, you know, we need to be able to develop sort of specialist skills in a way, and yet supposedly that's not what's useful either. So how do we reconcile that? How do we reconcile the notion on the one hand, we can't be just a specialist, but on the other hand, we can't be just a generalist because we need very advanced skills. Maybe next slide. And so somehow employers are now, in the future at least, going to be seeking people who actually specialize in being very flexible. That is, their specialist skills are their capacity to adapt to the changes and the flux in modern society. So next slide. So in particular, they'll be seeking people who have developed these particular skills, people who can analyze and interpret data very effectively, people who can sort of solve a whole range of problems creatively and appropriately, people who can communicate persuasively to others about their solutions and problems, people who can attract funding, and people who are sort of leaders in a particular area. These will be the skills that will become particularly important in the future, because these skills enable people to essentially become specialists in being generalists. That is, they have these very advanced capabilities to be able to adapt very rapidly to the changing work environment. And so essentially, completing a PhD or a master's is a way of attracting those skills. In fact, the PhD in particular will be sort of probably the main degree to be able to demonstrate those capabilities, data analysis, problem solving, communication, and so forth, and hopefully will secure very valuable jobs in the future. Okay. So that was the first true and false. So second true and false. After completing a PhD or master's by research, you earn the title doctor. Is that true or false? Anyone want to guess? Well, the answer is actually it's false in the sense that if you complete a PhD, you'll be called doctor. And a PhD tends to demand about sort of 3 to 4 years of work, mainly around a research project. If you complete a master's by research, another alternative, then you won't be called a doctor. And a master's by research tends to be completed within about 2 years. Okay, next slide. So true or false? PhD is pronounced fifth. Well, obviously that's not true. That's just a little joke to myself. So you can move on to the next slide. And this is probably more relevant to you. So who can apply? So true or false? You need to have completed at least 1 semester of research activity at an honours or postgraduate level to be eligible for a PhD. So do you think that's true or false? Well, essentially the answer is basically true. So to be eligible for a PhD, you need to have completed some research at either a postgraduate level, such as the Masters, say Masters of Information Technology, or an honours level. And you need to have completed about a semester worth of research activity. And actually, if you do enrol, and many of you have enrolled, say, in a Masters of Information Technology, where you are undertaking a thesis or research project, then you will actually be eligible for the PhD. Just as sort of one complication or caveat, you're only actually eligible if you completed this research activity, about 1 semester's worth, but also actually performed quite well, potentially sort of a distinction and above. So at this stage, most universities will be seeking people with some research activity, such as a master's thesis, as in the thesis component of your master's, or and people who have completed that master's and the research quite effectively. There's not usually an absolute precise cutoff, but normally around maybe a distinction average or a distinction on the research should be sufficient for most universities, including CDU. And if you perform particularly well, then you might be eligible for a scholarship as well. Generally, if you're around that sort of first class level or something like that, or maybe you've published a paper or two, then you're more likely to be eligible for a scholarship to complete your PhD. That scholarship's worth about $30,000 a year, just under $30,000 a year, but is tax-free. On the other hand, if you haven't quite completed that level of research activity, there are a couple of options for you. One is that you might be eligible for a master's by research instead. So if you've undertaken just a small amount of research, then you might be eligible for master's by research. And then actually you're allowed to enroll in the master's by research. And if you perform particularly well, if you start even sort of maybe publishing some of your research activity along the way, then you can actually upgrade potentially to a PhD within the first, say, 9 months or so. Then you can be eligible for PhD, and then you might even receive potentially a scholarship at that point. Alternatively, there are many other courses, maybe one-year courses you can undertake that helps you become eligible. So, there are around Australia, there are various graduate diplomas in research or other courses you can undertake to become eligible for PhD or Masters by research. And I can talk more about that later if there are further questions. Okay, so that's probably all I wanted to say about eligibility. So why would you do a PhD? What jobs can you secure if you complete a PhD or Masters by research? So maybe next slide, Sherry. So these photos here epitomise some of the jobs that could be applicable to you. And you might want to sort of guess what those jobs might be just from the photos. So, for example, obviously, if you complete a PhD or Masters by research, then you're eligible for research jobs, either at universities, in government, in research institutions, and even in many companies where there are particular research roles around R&D. Secondly, as the Parliament shows, you might be applicable for many roles that revolve around sort of policy, where you're actually developing policies and so forth to improve the industry in which you've conducted research. Thirdly, as the bottom left slide shows, you might be applicable for many sort of consulting roles as well, because you've essentially shown that you're a specialist and a leading expert in your area, sort of leading the development and advances within the domain in which you conducted your research. And finally, the slide with someone's writing, there's plenty of sort of writing jobs, science writing, science editorial jobs, and many other jobs available, but it's specifically useful for people with a PhD. Hopefully, in future years, the importance of PhD will become even more prominent, and there's some evidence that might occur, in which case a much broader range of jobs will be particularly applicable for people who have completed a PhD. Okay, so next slide. So just before I just talk a little bit about the abstract and the 2-minute thesis, I just want to quickly summarise what a PhD entails. So a PhD is usually a thesis. In fact, you might want to guess what these numbers represent, and then I'll give you the answers. So the 100,000 words that you might guess, that's the maximum number of words that a PhD entails. I should mention that for IT, there's sort of 2 types of PhDs that are quite common. One is that the typical PhD, you conduct some sort of research project, you write up a thesis of usually about 60 to 80,000 words with a maximum of 100,000. So it's quite long and it does take a few years, and you sort of need to develop your writing skills along the way. The other type of PhD is sometimes we call a thesis by creative output, where you actually create a product. It could be an IT product, a software or something like that, or something similar. And then you create this product, and then you write about this product in what's called an exegesis. So the thesis is both, or as in the PhD, is both the product you've created, as well as the description about the rationale that underpin this project, called an exegesis. On average, people take about 3.5 to 4 years to complete. That's what that 3.9 represents. And the scope of a PhD is about similar to about sort of 3 or so papers. So if you've read papers and publications in your field, then a PhD is normally about sort of 3 times that in terms of the scope of the issues you're examining, just to give you sort of some sense as to how big it is. I honestly can't remember what the 14 represents and the 28,000 represents. Just something like the RTP scholarship that you might be eligible for if you enroll in a PhD. Okay, next slide, thanks. Okay, so now I just thought I'd quickly talk a little bit about how to develop a research question. I'm not sure if you might have already developed a research question for the research competition, but this is also relevant for your future as well if you decide to continue and pursue a PhD or a master's by research. I just thought I'd give you a few quick tips. So essentially, the best way of developing a research question is to really think about, look, what are the problems you'd like to solve in society? What are the issues that affect you, affect your family, that you just feel are quite consequential and that you feel you might have some sort of skills to resolve in the future? And then to ensure that these problems are something unique, sometimes you should attempt to try to blend these problems together. You know, you might have several problems that you think are quite important. You see if you can sort of combine them in some way. I'll talk about why in a moment. And then you should try to imagine, look, what would the future be like if you solve this problem? How would things be different? How would you feel? How would the world or society change? And the reason is this attempt to integrate problems, as well as think about how the future might be different, has actually been shown to improve your creativity. And you start to sort of think about the problems and maybe a possible solution to these problems in a unique way. There's many other activities that improve creativity, but this is just an example. So next slide. And then it's probably worth, while you're developing your research project, and this is just a suggestion, of course, is to try to locate websites that often summarize the best publications or research in your field. There might be a subreddit that's relevant to you. There might be some other particular website, something like Science Daily, that you feel just summarizes some of the most exciting developments, advances and trends in your field. And what you should do is just very quickly skim maybe 50 or so of these publications or research that could be interesting, because research does indicate that if you just very rapidly skim lots of different publications, your creativity and thinking tends to improve as well. And then you might just transcribe a few little insights or thoughts, just something you find interesting. As you're reading, there'll be just something that resonates with you, something you think, I really want to explore this. I know about this. This is interesting to me. I want to include this somehow in my research. Next slide. And then you probably then translate from these sort of more popular scientific articles to more scholarly articles in your field. You might use Google Scholar or some other database that discusses the research that's relevant to you, the research that resonates with some of those interests that have been occupying your mind in the last few days or weeks. And then you might, collect some scholarly articles that could be relevant and read some of the best articles, the ones that really are most relevant to your work, at least twice. Some evidence indicates that somehow when we read a paper twice, we just generate a new insight about that paper that we hadn't before. And again, you're just collating a whole lot of little thoughts and ideas and insights together that you're going to integrate for a research question. Next slide. And then the final recommendation is that you then, with all these little insights, you start to try to sort them together. You find little insights and ideas and methods you want to use and problems you want to solve, and you start sort of collating them into little groups of similar ideas or insights, or these clusters, and then seeing if you can sort of integrate some of these clusters together. You might have several ideas that seem like they overlap in some ways. And you try to find ways, can I integrate these? Can I combine them to make an almost more creative idea? Okay, just a little quick process that just helps the way you think. Or what you might do is just identify your 2 or 3 favourite papers, the recent advances or publications in around your interest that you find most interesting, and see if you can combine those in some way to generate a creative idea. Anyway, and through this process, hopefully by that point, you'll identify a research question that really resonates with you. I'm not saying you have to go through this entire process, but it's just a nice discipline that you can follow that just helps you feel comfortable with the idea you want to put forth. It doesn't have to be the perfect idea, but you might feel much better after going through and applying this process. Next slide. And then finally, if you want to then submit like a proposal for a PhD or for the purpose of your work now, you often have to write an abstract. And so what's an abstract? What are the contents of this summary or abstract? How do you write one? Well, as you probably know, but I'll clarify anyway, an abstract tends to entail 5 sections. I mean, it looks like just one paragraph, but it'll tend to entail sort of 5 key points, just as a reminder. So the first is that you really want to specify in a sentence or two the problem that you're planning to solve, okay, or the problem that you have solved if it's past research. So what's the issue, okay? What is the problem? And you really want to be able to write that problem as tangibly as you can, so something is quite concrete and people can imagine. And then the next sentence or so often then specifies the aim of your research, which is basically to solve this problem, but you're being a little bit more specific, and I'll provide an example in a moment. And then in a sentence or 2 or maybe 3, you describe the method or approaches that you're trying to apply, the techniques you're using, how you're going about fulfilling this aim and resolving the problem. And then if it's about a future research, like a proposed research, then you might specify what the results could be. What is some outcome that you could achieve? Or if you're writing about research you've already undertaken, then you just summarize the actual observed results, the 2 or 3 key findings that you want to outline. And then finally, there's usually a sentence that describes the implication. What does this mean? How does it affect people? What's the key insight or conclusion that you want to generate? So just as an example, maybe next slide. So, I mean, here's a poor example, but just to show you some of the aspects. So you can see in this case, the first sentence might be about the notion that you're trying to solve the problem maybe your parents or grandparents are experiencing where they're struggling to complete online forms, maybe because of problems with their eyesight, digital literacy and so forth. And so the aim of your study will be to find some sort of form or process that circumvents these problems. Okay. Next slide. And then, the rest of the abstract might then specify, well, how are you going to go about doing this? What's the general approach you're using? Trying to use words that anyone can understand, or at least that the likely readers are going to understand. And then you might talk about, what the result would be, the finding. If successful, this tool could increase the likelihood that, older people might be able to complete forms, or reduce the anxiety when they complete forms, or whatever it might be. And then you talk about some sort of implication. And so that's basically an abstract in very simple terms. And of course, when you then present a 2-minute thesis or some other proposal, then basically you're just extending that abstract. You're just providing more details around that abstract, but with the same basic pattern, of starting with the problem, then the aims, the approach, results, and the implication. But just a couple of insights to keep in mind. I mean, the first is that whenever you're writing about the problem or indeed anything in the abstract, you try to use words that are as concrete as possible, that are easy to understand, easy to imagine. People are much more likely to believe anything and to be compelled by something you write if they can convert your words to a very clear and tangible image. That image almost sort of biases us. We're just more likely to believe anything that we can easily imagine. Secondly, when you're talking about or discussing the problem you want to solve, you want to include some evidence of the breadth and the magnitude of this problem. So, for example, you might want to include some statistics that highlight, maybe how many people are affected by this problem, if you can, or the costs of this problem to society, or even just the number of research articles that have explored this problem, or just something that highlights the breadth of this issue. And then, basically, as Sherry mentioned before, you're evaluated according to these criteria. Most of these criteria are fairly logical. Probably something that people sometimes forget is that they want to use a voice that's actually quite varied. Oh, so that's just a bit of feedback, is it? So it might be that someone still has a microphone on. So make sure you do have your microphone on just to reduce that feedback. Because I definitely don't want to hear myself twice. Even once is enough. But the final point I was going to make, thanks for that, is that before you say present any presentation, but particularly like as your 2-minute thesis, is that you want to think about and remember your unique skills, the knowledge that you have, and the skills you've developed that really sort of make you special, make you feel proud about yourself. Yeah, it might be around IT, but it might be something different as well. And just to think about, what makes you special, why you feel like you're like the leader, you're like the expert in what you're talking. Because as soon as you feel like the expert, it changes the way you tend to talk. You tend to sort of vary your pitch more. You tend to think a little bit better. You're much more animated in the way you speak. So it's just a nice way of preparing before a presentation, just to remember that you actually are the expert in what you're talking about. You might not be the expert in everything around your field, but at least some aspect of your field, you're the expert, you know your topic, and people are there to learn from you. And just in that moment where you feel like people are there to learn from you, you feel more confident, and so you tend to speak in a more engaging manner. Don't think of yourself as a student being evaluated. As soon as you feel like you're being evaluated by others, even though you might be, sometimes your confidence might diminish, and the extent to which you're engaging the audience might decrease as well. So that's really all I wanted to summarize. I'm happy to open up to questions about this topic, both as in the 2-minute thesis, the abstract, but also around sort of research and PhDs in general. So I'll give you a moment to think about a question, and if there's no questions, I just thank you for listening and wish you luck both for your research competition now and for your potentially research or other career in the future. And I should, if you do actually want to ask more questions at another time around like a potentially career as a PhD or Masters by Research, then feel free to email me at any time. I might write my email address in the chat, but it's basically just simon.moss@cdu.edu.au for further information about research, PhDs, or Masters by Research. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. Yes. So like Simon said, if you have any questions at later point, then just feel free to contact Simon or us or anything. Okay. So yes, I think Simon. We now have Joe. Joe is doing PhD at the moment. So at CDU actually. So I would like maybe Joe could share with us his experience about how did he come into taking PhD? What is the difficulty? What are the challenges? What are something that you like about it? And anything that you like to share. Okay.
Thanks, Sherry. Good morning, everyone. I'm Joe Mansour. I have been working with IBM for over 10 years across a couple of different roles, working in network infrastructure, a mainframe, storage library, and recently cloud computing. So in the past few years, I've seen issue with the cloud computing environment, and which is in the recent development in the cloud platform. So I was so excited that I want to start the research. I must say, like, I completed my master degree in 2013, so I have a fairly good break from research and from university. So I've been just working on the field. But I was so excited about the issue, but I didn't know how to start and where to start and how to develop my research questions. But I know there's a problem there, but I don't know where to start, how to solve it, how to look at the problem. So this is when I contacted CDU and I started my research journey in March this year. And so far it has been amazing journey. I've been learning a lot. I've been learning how to read research articles and how to do search for publications and how to develop my research questions and how to solve the problem I'm seeing. So Yeah, I'm not sure where to go from there, what to share. There has been always challenges for me, especially doing academic research and just, looking for article and reading publication. It was just challenging for me. But this is where my supervisors helped me in how to read the papers and how to try to understand the purpose of that paper and what the researchers are trying to solve, and how to do a systematic literature review on the different papers. So that's what I've been learning in the past few months, and this has really changed my perspective. I'm still working full time as well, so this has really changed my perspective and how to see things and how to solve things in this industries. But I must say too, I want to say that it's really hard for us IT research and IT guys to explain what we do for work or what we do for research to non-technical users. Like it's always challenging for me. I'm doing my research in serverless cloud computing, and it's always hard to explain this to non-technical users because they think I'm just doing something to do with PCs or laptops or computers. So I'm just excited to be here and to hear the stories. And that's my story. I'm happy to answer any questions, guys.
Thank you very much, Joe, for sharing. Yeah, and yes, I think that is one of the great thing to look at, because some people thinking that when they're doing PhD, do they have to actually focus on PhD, or can they work at the same time? And yeah, or even raising a family at the same time, so you've got three things.
Yeah, I think it would be impossible with family work and this PhD. But I agree. PhD is just time consuming, just all the reading that has to be done. But I think it helped me because I'm in that industry. So it just when reading a research papers, I'm seeing, I'm working with that stuff already. So I think that's helped me make it easier for me. But it's still challenging to do a full-time work and to do a research as well. And I'm considering by next year to change either part-time my research or to do work as a part-time and continue my research. But for sure, I'm continuing my research.
Yeah, and just to clarify the rules in a way, I should say that if you want to complete a PhD full-time, you're not supposed to work more than 15 hours a week. And really, you wouldn't be able to. It's too hard. Really, one day is probably enough of work. If you want to complete part-time, you're supposed to dedicate like 20 hours a week to your research. So that would mean you could probably work 30 hours a week maybe, but you couldn't work full-time. I think it's hard to work, it's almost impossible to work full-time throughout your entire research, because that would be a very difficult life. Although you might be able to work full-time for a while and then part-time other times or something like that.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Simon. Yeah, I'm just facing the same issue now. I already spoke to my supervisor. I was like, no, it's just too hard. And by next year, I have to change something to do part-time and the other have to be a full-time. So it's just challenging. I don't have a family. I think that's why I have more time, but it's hard.
It is.
Yeah. So I think that is a great idea to start early, because some people were just thinking that, okay, I'm just going to start working first, and then, then you start having family and so on. Then, you want to come back and then do PhD later, and then it's going to make that more difficult. Yes. So,
Jerry, yeah, this is what I felt for me. Like I completed my master back in 2013. I was working, and I was like, okay, I'm working now, so it's fine. I was interested in doing research, but because I just was working and just living life, and I think I procrastinate doing my research. But eventually, when I keep seeing the problems, and I know I could solve something, I know I could do something, and this is what gave me the drive.
Yeah. From my case, when I did my PhD at CDU, I was actually working full time as well, but I cheated a little bit, in the sense that before I started PhD, I already have background studying on that. And then that is something that perhaps you guys in the master degree could do that, because what I did is taking on what you have working, like the existing project into PhD.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you have background or the resources available. So then that's how I actually build up the PhD based on that. And on the PhD side, then you just have to write about it. And definitely you can use working experience or anything that you are working on. If your organization allowed, then I think that you can perhaps working and build up on something that is the demand for your company, and that would actually add on to your career as well.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, you're
Yeah.
absolutely right.
Yes. So thank you very much, Joe, for sharing. And then for the rest of you, if you are planning on taking research competition, I think this is a great start so that you can look at and inspect what is around the area. And then you will also get to meet a lot of academics to maybe ask your questions regarding your idea too. Thank you.
Thanks, Sherry. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. Thank you, everyone, for joining. And then good luck, everyone, for the research competition. Bye.